Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm David Odo, the director of the Georgia Museum of Art, and on behalf of the entire museum team, I'm delighted to welcome you back this morning to the Symposium on Ukrainian Art. This symposium is co-hosted by the Georgia Museum of Art and the Lamar Dodd School of Art. It's also being held in conjunction with 3 exhibitions which are hosted between our 2 institutions. The Georgia Museum's exhibition, The Awe of Ordinary Laborers, 20th Century Paintings from Ukraine, is the result of a long-term project that was initiated in 2018. Since that time, it has become even more relevant as we consider the suffering of the Ukrainian people and considerable and irretrievable loss of cultural heritage. I have the distinct pleasure of thanking a number of people that have made last night and today possible. First, I'd like to thank Professor Asen Kirin for his tireless efforts on many things related to this and other projects, especially the current exhibition, organizing this wonderful symposium, and for all the work he does teaching as a professor at the Lamar Dodd School of Art. Dr. Kirin also serves, of course, as the Parker Curator of Russian Art right here at the Georgia Museum, where he stewards one of the country's notable collections of Russian art. Additionally, I want to thank Professor Nicholas Allen and his team at the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts for their generous sponsorship of the symposium through a public impact grant. I would also like to thank Ms. Rose Brady and Professor Shelley Zurov for their support of the symposium. And I would also like to thank, a lot of people to thank, I want to thank and recognize a few esteemed colleagues we are fortunate enough to have here with us today. Professor Nathaniel Knight is here from Seton Hall University, and he spoke last night. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Miroslava Mudra from the Ohio State University, who will be speaking next soon as our keynote speaker, and also Professor Joseph Kellner from right here at the University of Georgia. So thank you to each of you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us and our students. Finally, I want to thank the Lamar Dodd School of Art graduate students who participated in a seminar last fall with Professor Kirin, focusing on themes and paintings in the museum's current exhibition. That exhibition opened in mid-January and will close June 1st, so I hope if you haven't already, you'll have a chance to take a look at that show upstairs. So we hear from each of the students today, and I just wanted to thank you all personally for the work and preparation you have invested in this project. So very excited to hear your research results. So without further ado, Asen, could I have you come on up and welcome? Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for delivering the opening remarks at today's session. Before I turn to the honorable duty of introducing our keynote speaker today, I would like to go over the schedule for the symposium so that we all know what's coming. After hearing our keynote lecture, which will start shortly, there will be a second presentation by Professor Kellner, and then we will have a coffee break, which will be followed by 3 student sessions. The student sessions will be moderated by graduate students, and we all hope to conclude the work on the symposium by 4:30 this afternoon. There are 8 copies of a book that was donated to us for the occasion of the symposium. This is the publication of the Ukrainian paintings collection of Mr. Monichuk and Rose Brady. Ms. Brady donated these books so we can distribute them among members of the public who are interested in having this publication. Callan displayed the books on the table where the labels and the sign-up sheet is. So if you're interested, you can get a free copy of the catalog that represents the entire collection. 6 paintings in this collection belong to the Georgia Museum of Art. The other 34 are from the Parker collection of Ukrainian painting. All these works are on display on the second floor. Also, I wanted to say that we are recording today's presentations in order to make them available on hopefully YouTube, and this will allow our donors, Ms. Rose Brady and Mr. William Parker, to see the proceedings, even though because of health reasons they cannot attend the event today, but they send their special greetings to all participants. And now it is my honor and utmost pleasure to introduce Professor Miroslav Mudrak, who is this morning's keynote speaker. Professor Mudrak received her MA from Columbia University and her doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin. She has had a long and distinguished career at Ohio State University at Columbus, where she is an emerita professor of art history. Among the many accomplishments and remarkable distinctions through her career, I would like to highlight 2 Fulbright fellowships, one to the Czech Republic, the other one to Poland. Professor Mudrak has had the distinction of being a research fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute twice in her career. Professor Mudrak has published on modern Ukrainian art, and I would like to point out her book on Boris Kosarev. I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name. Modernist Kharkiv, 1915 to 1931. Also, a very intriguing book titled Beyond Borders, Modern Ukrainian Book Covers, 1914-1945. In connection with today's lecture, I would like to highlight one of the most recent accomplishments of Professor Mudrak that has to do with a recent exhibition of Ukrainian modern art that attracted attention all around the world. The Royal Academy in Britain, in London, organized an exhibition in conjunction with other museums from Europe that featured a great number of paintings on loan from the National Art Museum in Kiev, in Ukraine. These paintings were taken out of Kiev at the time when the city was under intense bombardment in the current war. But eventually the paintings made it to London and they were displayed in a beautiful exhibition. In connection with this exhibition at the Royal Academy, the Courtauld Institute, a very prestigious independent self-governing college belonging to the University of London, organized a conference, and Dr. Mudrak was one of the keynote speakers there. I wish I could have the opportunity to attend this lecture. The lecture was on modern Ukrainian theater, or related to modern Ukrainian theater. So today we will have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Mudrak's talk. Please join me in welcoming our keynote lecturer.
Thank you very much, Asen. That was a lovely introduction. Sometimes I wonder as I sit there who you're talking about. But thank you all for coming on this Friday morning. I'm going to make remarks that I hope relate to the exhibition. But before I begin, I'd like to say thank you to William Parker and Rose Brady, who are now becoming the stewards of this movement, shall I call it, where we're bringing recognition to Ukrainian art that has so long been sidelined, marginalized, and virtually unknown. So thank you for joining in this program. So let me begin. when in the early 1930s, the dubious term socialist realism came into being, it was nothing more than an official summation of aspirational guidelines directed primarily at the literary community. Descriptive qualities such as class and ideological consciousness, party-mindedness, and truthfulness, generically formulated and publicly announced by Maxim Gorky at the First Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934, offered a roadmap, as it were, for creative individuals to respond to the ideological demands of the era. Soon the same principles were applied to the visual arts in loosely phrased declarations formulated by former members of organizations such as the AKHR, that's an acronym for the Association of Artists of Revolutionary Russia, which was dissolved in 1932 as part of Stalin's plan to consolidate his authority over every aspect of life in the Soviet Union. The irony of AKHR's demise under Stalin is that the organization resurrected realist art after 2 decades of avant-garde formalism and experimentation, and upheld the tendentious strain of 19th century realism. It was the realists, known as the Wanderers, that socialist realism set up as a model for painters. Of all the organizations that were being shut down, the artists of AKHR most closely adhered to Stalin's notion that art must serve society. The simplicity of imagery fostered by AKHR, both in subject and in its readability, bridged the gap created by the unharnessed energy of breakaway modernism in the 1910s and 1920s, and was put to task to shape the minds and the spirit of Soviet citizens after a period of great artistic experimentation and innovation. Realism, inflected by Marxist-Leninist principles, was essential under Stalin for homogenizing the society and for formulating what in post-Soviet times would be described as the Homo Sovieticus, a species of mankind baked and crusted over in communist mythologies. So we need to imagine living in a straitjacketed society where you're reminded daily of your responsibility to a body of people no different from you, seemingly engaged in a common goal, an ongoing process of constructing an intangible utopia. Everyone recognizes the falsehood, but no one dares speak about it or say it aloud. What we see largely in socialist realism and in socialist realist art is a society kept busy. Robust images of healthy laborers at work, sun-drenched landscapes with factory chimneys churning out steam and smoke, patriotic scenes of victory and sacrifice for noble goals, and of course, portraits of Politburo members, the leaders of the people, and the ubiquitous figure of Lenin's intimate engagement with his followers. This is the content of pure socialist realism. I want to show you a few images to kind of carve this into your mind. A poster, a study for a poster. And mind you, this is part of the later period before even AKHR was shut down. 1937, representatives in the spirit of Lenin, whose statue you see in the corner. Farm laborers at rest. Note the sun-drenched fields, the relaxed figures, rather happy. And let me go back. As a handy moniker adopted by the Stalinist regime, bent on indoctrinating its people, the concept of socialist realism hung threateningly, like the sword of Damocles, over the heads of artists, whose only real ambition in life was to have the freedom to pursue their calling and to make a living by it. But the idea of the individual or personal freedom falls beyond the prescriptions for Homo Sovieticus, and thus anything outside the rules could potentially derail the natural ambitions of the artist. After all, every human action was to be directed solely at the state, not at personal satisfaction. There was no way to mitigate personal freedoms with the dictates of the state. And socialist realism was the way to keep creative individuals in check. Deviating from the program would mean that the artist would be denied access to materials, to exhibitions, to the market, which in this case was the state, and ultimately it meant not having a livelihood as an artist. So herein lies the dilemma. Put yourself in the shoes of an artist whose meaning of life is determined by his or her ability to draw, to paint, to sculpt, to design. Do you give up all of that and just work in the factory or in the fields to be safe? And if your proclivity is to explore shapes and forms in their abstract combinations enhanced by color, rather than duplicate the world on your canvas as if you were looking out your window, how do you reconcile the two approaches? Socialist realist painting requires a degree of witnessing, even if having to be duplicitous in depicting its falsehoods. Indeed, if you looked out your high-rise window in the drab gray tenements of the Soviet era, you would only see a reflection of yourself, trapped in a cramped world of your own making, trying to find a way to jettison yourself out. The late Ukrainian-born Ilya Kabakov captured this sensation in his installment entitled "The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment." This dates to 1984. And you'll notice that the space is really quite cluttered with images of places outside of Soviet reality. So posters, paintings, anything that would remove the artist's psyche out of the cramped quarters that he was forced to live in. Kabakov survived it all by turning to children's book illustration before emigrating to the West just before the collapse of the communist state. The urge to create an alternative world within the confining high walls of socialist realism stimulated artists to go underground, particularly during the period after Stalin's death and the slight loosening of the noose under Khrushchev's fall. In Ukraine, they were called the 60ers, or Shestidesiatniki, a brave generation of the 1960s that took great risks to use their writings, poetry, music, and art to reestablish their Ukrainian cultural identity within what had already become a strictly homogeneous Soviet society. Although most suffered severe day-to-day persecutions, and many of them were ultimately sent to the Gulag or eliminated under suspect circumstances, they were still able to lay a foundation for a subtle resistance to the status quo. One of the most noted cases was that of artist Alla Horska, a defiant artist whose life was taken in her own apartment. Her activism began with a project commissioned and approved by Kyiv University for the lobby of the institution. This was to be a large-scale stained glass mural honoring the namesake of the institution, the Ukrainian bard Taras Shevchenko. Rather than taking up a socialist realist subject, she focused instead on a passage from the Ukrainian bard's poetry. Taras Shevchenko was the namesake of the university. Once a serf, Shevchenko wrote, "I will glorify those voiceless slaves My words will stand guard around them. Horska integrated these words into the mural, showing the shackles of tyranny being broken by an angry Shevchenko off the wrists of a symbolic Mother Ukraine. An image of a bound mother signaling national sentiments had no place in socialist realism. And in the early mornings of March, before the mural was to be unveiled publicly, the stained glass project was shattered and destroyed. Not long after, Horska was found murdered in her apartment. Open resistance was swiftly quieted by surveillance and arrests of the generation of the 60ers. Yet the brazen breaking down of socialist realist stereotypes spawned the rebirth of a nation that has survived years of suppression. At the risk of becoming persona non grata and annihilation, artists who long to have a voice to release their longing to be part of the modern and free world would express a universal desire and find ways to survive by masking their creative output within the superficial socialist realist trappings. It was not difficult to insert these traits, which every well-trained student of art learned early on, that is, sun-filled canvases of agricultural workers, steaming factories of industry, victory on the battleground, and Lenin among the people. The interpretation of socialist realism under such circumstances required fashioning an alternate reality, not always coinciding with the facts on the ground. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the institutions that help sustain the status quo under the dictates of socialist realism. The propagation of socialist realism in Soviet times was a way of gaining control over art training institutions. And herein lies the irony of setting up the realists as models for socialist realism. When, after the abolition of serfdom in 1861, the Western directions of the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts, first instituted by Empress Elizabeth I and credentially aggrandized by Catherine II, focused on classical mythology and romantic figures of European civilization, the ostentatious aims of the Academy were in competition with sister institutions abroad, became too incongruous with the wretched life of the people in Imperial Russia. This incongruity was noted by a young generation of academic renegades coming from small towns in Ukraine who knew the plight of the peasantry intimately and addressed its existential moments. I have in mind specifically Ilya Repin, Ivan Kamsky, the Russian version of his name is Kamskoy, and Nikolai Gay, who broke away from the dominance of the Academy and turned their backs on the revered and prestigious imperial institution that was preoccupied with artistic hermeticism with no true connection to the realities of life. The artists headed out among the people, surviving the ignominies of imperial rule. Traveling from town to town, the artists not only brought their paintings to the people, but developed new themes focused on their witnessing of misery and woe. As breakaway artists, they came to be known as the Wanderers, toting their artwork from place to place. In Russian, the word to carry in transit is peredvigat, hence they were called peredvizhniki. Their localized subject matter and the depiction of life under the Tsars, presented in vivid rawness, established a strong realist school of painting. One could argue that in their defiance, in their rejection of institutional art, and in the abandonment of a classic academic style of painting for a more spontaneous, impressionistic manner, the Peredvizhnik movement was the beginning of a turn toward contemporaneity, a mark of true modernism. The aims of the realist movement within Imperial Russia also corresponded with the call for radical social change, as outlined in Nikolai Chernyshevsky's activist novel, What is to be Done, of 1863, and in Lev Tolstoy's treatise, What is Art, in 1897. In both these tracts, the call to action was based on the premise that art should bring about a material transformation in society. It may have inspired the direction of the Peredvizhniki as a whole, and certainly underscored the future aims of socialist realism. But few recognize the hidden inspiration in the work inspired by these writings. And I'm pointing out here the spirit of Shevchenko. A portrait by Kremsky of Shevchenko stands alongside a typical woodsman, an anonymous woodsman, subjects that were of the peasantry that were taken up by the Peredvizhniki. By the same token, Repin also included Shevchenko as an exile in a portrait that you see in the upper left on the wall. That's the portrait of Shevchenko. This painting, they didn't expect him, the family not expecting the return of the exile coming home. So part of the reason so many of the talented artists came to St. Petersburg, such as Kremsky and Repin from Ukraine, is that under the Tsars, there was a prohibition on the Ukrainian language and on cultural institutions. That was by official edict. Thanks to the suppressive tactics of the imperial seat, there were little prospects for professional artistic development in Ukraine. Most art training was done in private studios that mostly prepared artists for entry into the academy in Russia. At the turn of the century, the Kiev Art School also produced, however, some independent artists who would find their own way through modernism and shape radical pathways for art outside the academy. It was there that the future avant-gardists like Alexander Ekster, Alexander Bohomazov, and Kazimir Malevich got their first training. I'm purposely showing you an earlier work by Malevich because Malevich had trained with Pimonenko, Mykola Pimonenko, Ukrainian artist who had taught at the Kiev Art Studio. And I just wanted to give you an example of how Malevich was really paying tribute to his teacher. Only after the revolution brought down the empire and Ukrainians seized the opportunity to declare independence and sovereignty was the Ukrainian Academy of Art established in Ukraine. That was 1917. One of the first acts of the new nation state, the Ukrainian National Republic, was to create an art institution, one that would hardly be likened to the art academies of the past, and where realism and ideology had no place. Those appointed to teach at the First Ukrainian Academy of Arts were seasoned travelers in modernism. From Georgy Narbut, its first rector-director, who had established a successful standing among the Russian Mirispustniki in St. Petersburg before returning to Ukraine to head the graphics division of the Academy, to Mikhailo Boychuk, who was recognized as early as 1909 in Paris by Guillaume Apollinaire as having created a neo-Byzantine school of painting, to the brothers Fedyin and Vasil Kryczevsky, the latter an architect who ushered in the style of Ukrainian moderne, and the former a monumentalist working in the spirit of secessionism, to Abram Manevich, a skilled impressionist. All these artists defined a program of artistic training that was relevant to the era of emancipation from Russian domination and the expectations of a new modern state with a contemporary culture. Within a decade after its founding, the Ukrainian Academy of Arts was transformed into an art technicum to respond to the new socialist climate and to prepare artists to work in tandem with industrialization. Every effort was made by the new director, Ivan Vorona, to make the Institute a premier higher art teaching institution in the USSR, inviting artists like Kazimir Malevich, Vladimir Tatlin, Viktor Palmov, and Pavlo Holubyatniku, who had already established themselves in Moscow to teach at the institution. I'll just show you the kind of and temperament of art that you see in the latter years after the Technicum was really at its height. At the point that the Technicum was at its height. It became a very strong pedagogical institution where Tatlin and Malevich were invited to teach. As progressive and impressive as the Kiev Art Institute may have been, it was reorganized in 1930 to meet the new state criteria and renamed as the Institute of Proletarian Culture. And it remained that from 1930 to 1934. Now, mind you, if you're wondering why I'm talking about all these earlier times, I'm trying to lead up to the period of art that we see represented in the exhibition, so that you know that the artists that are represented in the exhibition have received the legacy of the Institute that I'm talking about. And hence what you're seeing in their art are really remnants or tokens of a very progressive artistic learning institution. So during the years of the Kiev Art Institute, the Neo-Byzantine style, with the second generation of followers of Boychuk, were given important commissions to paint community centers, workers' clubs, and sanatoria. Parallel to Diego Rivera's muralist works, the Boychukis painted the interiors of these spaces in keeping, it would appear, with the tenets of socialist realism. Factory workers joined with agricultural laborers, new professionals teamed with local managers. The Boychukist imagery was replete with imagery of a perfect society. But that was not enough, apparently. To the degree that Boychukism was focused on not the global proletariat, but like Rivera's Mexican workers, on the national element, Boychukism was tagged as subversive, and Boychuk himself labeled a bourgeois nationalist, the Kremlin label for undesirables. By the mid-1930s, the movement was brought down, its members dispersed by Stalinist forces. Despite seemingly fulfilling the dictates of socialist realism, the leading followers of Boychuk were charged with sedition. During Stalin's infamous purges, many of Boychuk's followers were executed, along with a multitude of intellectuals, writers, and poets who had brought about a modern cultural renaissance in Ukraine in the 1920s. As a result, the year 1937 proved to be a death knell for Ukrainian modernism. The murals of the Boychukis, still visible on the walls of the Institute and in the workers' clubs and elsewhere, were whitewashed, and the teaching at the Kiev Art Institute proceeded cautiously with a new staff compliant with the dictates of socialist realism. And around this time, Malevich was teaching at the Institute from 1927 to 1930. So this is happening at the same time that Malevich actually formulated his pedagogical tracts in a series of articles that were published in Ukraine over the years 1927 to 1930. But the climate is terribly repressive, and by 1930, Malevich returns to Russia, and he also turns to a more contemplative style of art, fashioning himself in a self-portrait in Renaissance garb, kind of recalling some of the sources of Boychukism, which drew on Renaissance mural painting. Despite the progressive nature of the renamed Kiev Technical Artistic Higher Technical School, which had often been likened to the level of the Bauhaus, the changing political tides in the USSR, once Stalin came to power, put every institution at risk of closer scrutiny. In refocusing its efforts to the traditional genres of academic painting, specifically portraiture, landscape, and still life, the now again renamed Kyiv Art Institute became the premier teaching institution in the Soviet era. Many of the artists in today's exhibition who attended the school, and I'm going to just show you a few of the slides of the artists who attended the Kyiv Art School: Basaraba, Pirohov, Lysenko, Nechayev, and Tsavanovsky. Tsavanovsky was originally from Moldova, but many artists from many parts of the Soviet Union would come to study at the Kyiv institution. So despite its most innovative modernists, the Kyiv Art Institute survived in a retrograde form of training in genres traditional to 19th century art education that honored the traditional academic artistic hierarchy of portraiture, landscape, and still life, blurring the boundaries among them by overtones of ideological import. It is in that spirit that artists would gain membership to the official Union of Artists, through which they could sell their works and receive commissions from the state. One could say that union artists were state-approved artists, and many collectors, such as Yuri Manichuk, would navigate these lists to rescue, as it were, Ukrainian art from demise. Aside from Kyiv, Odessa also figured prominently as an art center since the latter part of the 19th century in Ukraine. Galvanized by the painter Kyriak Kostandi, a native of the region whose talent took him to St. Petersburg to study at the academy, Odessa distinguished itself as an organized art center with a diverse ethnic makeup. Odessa was particularly instrumental in launching Ukrainian modernism in the 1910s, when the first exhibitions of Western modernism were staged there, and in nearby Kherson by Odessite Vladimir Izdebsky. Over 2 consecutive years, beginning in the winter of 1909, the so-called Izdebsky salons introduced the population of southern Ukraine to French modernist art, primarily the Fauvists and Cubists, before touring through the main centers of the empire. Some of you will be reminded that Vasily Kandinsky had also completed his art studies at the Odessa Art School and even published his first theoretical tract, which he called Whither the New Art, which formed the basis of his On the Spiritual in Art. He published this essay in the Odessa newspaper before beginning his monumental mission toward European abstraction abroad. It was also in the vicinity of the Black Sea coastline that David Burliuk and his futurist followers laid the ground for the most extremist of modernist gestures, just at the brink of the First World War. Here's another work by Bourluc, just to show you the advanced experimentation and innovation, the creativity, the spirit of limitless possibilities that existed prior to socialist realism. Even Sonia Delaunay, who emigrated to France, recalled her time in Odessa, remembering the colors of the peasants' costumes during wedding festivities. It inspired her own dynamic use of color. After the death of Kyriak Kostandi, the Odessa Art School produced artists engaged in revolutionary propaganda, particularly in posters for the Ukrainian chapter of the Russian Telegraph Agency in Odessa. And I'm just going to, this is one of the works by Kostandi that I wanted to point out in this realist manner. But we also need to note that more than just realism, it has an existential overtone to it that differed considerably from the mimetic style of the Peredvizhniki. And to compare it, I brought in a work that we have upstairs by Babenko, which is equally powerful, I think, from the standpoint of a kind of an interior life. But one of the students that came out of the Odessa school was Boris Agers, who in very intimate, beautifully intimate paintings upstairs really captured both the energy, the experimentation, as well as the ability not to deviate too much from socialist realist themes by a landscape of very active excavators in the background. I'm going to move along a little bit. The artist Sinitsky studied directly under Kostandi. His works show a real sensitivity to lush landscape and physical texture. Thick impasto belies the loose layering of paint as practiced by the Impressionists. His compositional arrangements are defined by contrasting swaths of color that demarcate sharp shifts in the spatial field. The seemingly baked crustiness of a country path with tracings of muddy grooves is made palpable by brushwork that recreates the directional movement of the roadway. In the case of, this is another work by Sinitsky, which really is very telling of the liberties that they were taking with the autonomy of painting as its own language. In the case of Mykola Varenya, the stark contrasts of light and dark come across as an abstract patterning, geometrically ordered. Under the influence of the Wanderers, whose post-impressionistic style and tendentious social themes dominated the art scene, Kostandi had become the promoter of Peredvizhnitstvo, the style and ideas of the Wanderers in Odessa and its environs. He was also a great proponent of painting out of doors, a method the French termed en plein air, that is, in the open air. While Kostandi's own paintings took up social themes, they tended away from the tendentious and gravitated toward the existential and philosophical. Living in the warmer south, with the sea breezes from the Black Sea on his back, Kostandi's palette tended to be sunnier and brighter than would be found among his northern contemporaries. And he cultivated these atmospheric sensibilities in the wispiness of his brushwork and focused on textual materiality. Kostandi's influence, I'm going to skip this, carried over into the teaching at the Odessa School of Art, which he headed and propped up on the level of an art academy. Here, probably landscape more than any other genre gained prominence. Landscape functioned as an important genre for revealing oftentimes cryptic, but sometimes overt social-political messaging in Soviet-era painting. But what about still life? From the standpoint of academic hierarchy, still life painting had been seen as more of a divertissement than a serious genre for trained academic painters. Indeed, often called low painting, and this comes from Pliny, or an extract of a narrative which dislodges and serves as a distraction from an important historical context. The still life genre had long been regarded as belonging to the realm of descriptiveness, something like decoration. Yet, in the context of socialist realism, it was an important forum for revealing other truths. The artists who painted still lifes toyed with the idea of an unintended pause or a momentary suspension from lived experience. Therefore, many artists turned to painting bountiful flowers set on tables, some as an aesthetic escape from the drab gray world in which they were forced to live, others as a way of refraining from the weightiness of socialist themes, wishing not to deal with them at all. Indeed, considering the historiographical standpoint of the late Max Friedlander, whose classic text, Landscape Portrait Still Life, published in 1949, put still life genre last, it seems reasonable that painting still lifes would have been a safe preoccupation for many artists, as we see here and as we see upstairs. Just a few examples. Portraiture, too, could be seen as a deflective genre. While in classical academicism, portraiture stood on the highest order of things as it served as documentation of the ruling class, in everyday portraiture under the big thumb of socialist realism, portraiture appears on the same level of detachment that is noted in still lifes. For example, the anonymity of the sitters in paintings bespeaks of a trend to not identify the person for fear of any kind of recrimination, or to title the work generically, here's just a portrait of a young woman, or the portrait of a young kolkhoz woman, in order to avoid any kind of recrimination. That way, if there is any objection to the way the portrait was painted, or any question of the way it adheres to socialist realism, one remains fairly safe in passing the test of approval. It would be considerably worse should the sitter be identified as having a relationship with the painter. So like still life, portraiture under socialist realism may depict human presence, but the portrait is, in most cases, a deliberate act of depersonification, a handy submission to the concept of homo sovieticus. Only the material traces of objects put together links it to human contact. And forgive me for this, but I think there is a connectivity, art historical connectivity that is worth mentioning. As here, only the material traces of objects put together links it to human contact. Dutch still life painting teaches us about the presence, but also the non-presence of the physical being, a reminder of the brevity of life and the sudden removal of our engagement with life on earth. The still lives of 17th century Dutch painter De Geem are informative examples about human abandonment and the brevity of life. Indeed, in French, nature morte literally translates as dead or inert nature. Probably a misnomer, but certainly meaningful in terms of socialist realism. For it implies a morbid stillness, an obfuscation of the human element. This is not to imply that the reference to life is not present in the work. It's just that it is the absence of human agency, which in socialist realism is the sole protagonist. So by contrast, if we look at lush images such as Sergei Gerasimov's collective farm harvest, showing a rich spread of food brought out for the group of farm workers to enjoy, though not a strict still life, it tells a story sharing in the sharing in the products of the community's labor, where the human element is shared within the parameters of the still life objects and bounty that you see before you. Here I'd like to make a slight shift to the artist Katerina Bilokur, of poor peasant stock, who tried many times to realize her artistic aspirations and to move from Poltava to Kiev to study at the Institute. But as a self-taught artist without a record and no art school training per se, she failed to gain access to the institution. Instead, she painted directly from nature. She focused on the flora of her environment and produced exquisite detailed paintings of the most beautiful flowers cultivated by Ukrainians. Unlike Dutch still life of the Reformation period with their existential messaging, there were no underlying themes beyond the descriptiveness of Bilokur's representations. Sheer beauty and the aesthetic enjoyment was attained with each stroke of the brush. Had she been admitted to the Kiev Art Institute, her meticulous realism would certainly have won the approval of authorities who adjudicated over artistic production. But she remained unknown and unnoticed despite her prolific output of so-called decorative paintings. Were it not for paintings such as a field on a collective farm, and I hope you can make out that there's a combine in the distance in the field. Bilokur's innate talent allowed her to follow the outlines of imposed socialist realism and yet skirt the tendentious messaging. In this painting, which blends still life with landscape, her work gained favor with the higher powers and allowed her to become a Ukrainian artist of renown until her death in 1961. One could extend the socialist realist mindset to works like Holub's melons upstairs, also a display of juicy fruit illuminated by the southern sun on a hot late summer day, but with a slight alteration to the socialist realist formula. Looking closely, the way that Holub paints his melons asserts the flatness of the picture plane and defies the illusionism practiced by the mimetic strains of realism by making the plate appear as if suspended, unaffixed to the picture's surface. So too, the detached knife, seemingly afloat in yet another spatial plane, suggests that the artist is exploring approaches outside the strict framework of socialist realism. The rough highlighting around the circumference of the plate and alongside the knife catch the light, functioning in the manner of iconography, only to affirm the autonomy of the painting elements, functioning honestly in the pictorial space, bereft of any other meaning than providing a sensorial experience, a truly modernist gesture. Although I must thank Professor Keaton because he identified this kind of melon as...
He was a student.
He was a student. Well, I thank the student who identified the element of the kind of melon that was named after the collective farm labor. That was pretty clever, thank you. So by the 1960s, artists, by the 1990s, artists would become much more overt. Before I go into that, I want to show you the quintessential kind of premier image of socialist realism that you will see in every standard text. This is the Ukrainian artist Tatyana Yablonska's grain, sometimes it's translated as wheat. Tatyana Yablonska came out of the Kiev Art Institute, and she was she had a tremendous impact on the future of painting in Ukraine through the 70s in particular, and on the dissident movement in the 70s and early 80s. So, I have just 2 more pages. By the 1990s, artists would influence of Yablonska, I think, can be seen in these works. Arkady Soroka, the sun, the sun, the sun, the grain, the sun-drenched, sun-tanned faces. Workers who are not downtrodden, they're actually just engaged with life and the elements. And another one by Soroka, I think, is definitely influenced by Yablonska. Okay, and now I'm close to the end. By the 1990s, artists would become much more overt in their modernist practices, but with an ironic look back and reverse nod in the direction of socialist realism. A case in point is the artist Zhanna Kadyrova. At the 2019 Venice Biennale, Kadyrova displayed a still life project reminiscent of the quotidian vulgarity of Soviet living. And I mean vulgar in the everyday sense. After the invasion of Russia in February 2022, she expanded the notion by the project she called Palyanitsia, which relates a little bit to the melon, the name of the melon, Palyanitsia, which brought to light the artificial casus belli of the war itself, namely the protection of Russian language speakers in Ukraine, as one of the reasons that Putin thought it important to invade Ukraine. Palyanitsia is the Ukrainian name for a common round bread baked in Ukraine and commonplace in Ukrainian kitchens. Those living in Ukraine were very familiar with the term. Outsiders, such as the invading Russian army, could not pronounce the name, which allowed the locals to immediately recognize who was local and who was the enemy. Using the still life idiom, Kadyrova presented her project as a means of demonstrating resistance against the curtailment of Ukrainian freedoms and sovereignty. The unprovoked imposition of war on the Ukrainian nation was seen as the most egregious action of the Kremlin. Kadyrova's project consisted of river stones that simulate the round, smooth shape of the Palyanitsia bread. The project was presented at the Venice Biennale in April 2022, bringing attention to the artifice of Russia's provocation, using every excuse to invade Ukraine with the aim of erasing Ukrainian culture. So let me sum up. What makes the acquired collection of Ukrainian paintings at the Georgia Museum of Art so compelling is that on the surface of things, the works maintain the illusion of a harmonious Soviet society and thus have passed the official muster of socialist realist standards. And the reason I say that is because they were available, they weren't destroyed, and the artists were living, for the most part, when Yuri Manichuk was collecting the art. However, as modern painters who well understand the autonomous nature of art in any creative undertaking, the artists have succeeded in subtly manipulating the devices of socialist realist painting to express a gamut of existential moments. They carry socialist realism, if we even choose to use this term perfunctorily to describe these works, through a lengthy period of cultural stasis in Ukraine. By this I mean that there are no detectable stages of development, no real evolution, no stylistic changes, no singular personalities to emerge, who would or did decisively change the course of art. Over the period of the 1950s through the 1970s, this conservative and therefore safe art, which is no longer socialist realist at its core, functioned as a cover for a percolating resistance that would reach its apogee in a widespread dissident movement. I think I'll stop there, and I thank you for your attention, and I hope maybe this generates some discussion. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller. This was a wonderful panoramic picture that gave us a bird's eye view into which our collection and our exhibition fits. Thank you. That was wonderful. Let's have any questions. Let's have questions. Any questions? Any comments? We can continue. If there are no questions that we can answer now, we can continue the conversation during the coffee break, which will follow the second talk break. Thank you again. Our second speaker this morning will discuss the history of Soviet Ukraine and give us an insight into the political and cultural circumstances in which the works of art on display in our exhibition were created. Professor Joseph Kellner joined the Department of History at the University of Georgia in 2020. Before that, he was a visiting lecturer in Russian and global history at the University of California at Berkeley, where he gained his PhD and his MA. Dr. Kellner is working on two book projects. They're almost completed. The first one is titled The Spirit of Socialism, Culture and Belief of the Soviet Collapse. This is a manuscript that was submitted to Cornell University Press and is expected to come out this year. The book is dealing with the appearance of multiple new religious developments in the former communist world at the time of the collapse of communism. It's really shocking for me. I lived through it. It's for Professor Kellner. This is a historic period from the past that has to be examined in a monographic form. And he has another project titled Red Against Empire, Bolshevik Historians and the Anti-Colonial Critique. This is another substantial co-edited book project. For his research, Professor Kellner received the Virginia Mary Macagnoni Prize for Innovative Research Work. Well, please join me in welcoming Professor Kellner.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that introduction. We're moving out of the art historical mode here. Not an art historian, but just a plain historian. And the purpose of my talk is to situate Ukrainian socialist realist art historically. So to understand the ideology, especially the Stalinist ideology underlying this genre, and to situate it both within the Stalinist Soviet Union and within the Ukrainian Republic within the Soviet Union. But as a matter of prefacing, I want to stress above all that Bolshevism is modern, that we should not think of the Bolshevik dictatorship, of a Stalinist dictatorship in the Soviet Union as somehow backward or a deviation from the modern world. for two reasons. I think that there's a tendency for people to assume that highly centralized power is something of the past, and that with time we see the evolution of political power. This is a really common misconception. There really is no correlation between concentration of power and historical time. But second, there is a correlation between historical time and power of the state. So power may or may not be centralized, but absolutely modern states are extremely powerful compared to what came before. And this is what makes Bolshevism and any ideological dictatorship distinctly modern. The power to influence lives, even the thoughts of everybody in the state, with mass media, mass communication, standardization of education, and certainly with art. This belongs to the modern period, really to the 20th century. And so we should not conceive of Lenin and Stalin as new czars or as kings, and we should not conceive of the Soviet Union as, or the region of Ukraine as they were under the Russian Empire. So the Soviet Union is an ideological dictatorship, an entirely modern form, and Ukraine, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, takes a peculiar and modern form within it. I'll have an outline. A brief history of how the Ukrainian SSR comes to be, and then the Soviet policies that create this peculiar and entirely novel form of state within a state. And then at the end, I'll connect this all to socialist realism. I want to note, though, that all of my images appear blurry. I am, again, not an art historian. I've never thought about my images, and I never imagined they would be on a screen as large as this one. And so when I was watching Professor Druck's presentation, I realized that my images are really secondary to the talk, and so prepare to be underwhelmed or overwhelmed by yeah, they will get the job done, I hope. First, a whirlwind introduction to Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. Bolshevism is a zealous ideological movement. They believe very fervently in their version of Marxism. And so to understand the Soviet Union at all, we have to begin there with what I can call orthodox Marxism. And here, you're very overwhelmed. Karl Marx is not an important figure in this talk. And I didn't think he would be 10 times my size here. For our purposes, the figure of Marx doesn't really matter. But his ideas matter a lot, of course. And the next image I pulled from Google, the Google image search, certainly the largest it's ever been projected. But it works well enough. Essentially here, a picture of Marx's vision of history, and starting somewhere in the middle there, with the era of feudalism, there's a very clear tiered understanding and progressive understanding of the movement of history that within, let's say, the feudal world, we have a system of estates and orders that's very clearly defined, but with historical time, contradictions emerge in it, and the economic form as it changes comes ill-suited to the political form. In the case of the feudal era, Marx imagines the bourgeoisie, the urban middle classes, the owner class, as emerging and fitting very uneasily into the system, eventually becoming a revolutionary force within the system, and ushering in the next stage of bourgeois democracy, as he would have it, of liberal capitalist democracy. More important for the Soviet case, of course, within liberal capitalism, the growth of the working class and the emergence of the working class as an oppressed and larger and more conscious, self-aware class that ultimately comes to be large enough to be the universal class of humanity. He sees the capitalist system as moving inexorably towards a division between a very small owner class and the working class, that is ultimately not represented by the bourgeois democratic system, where money speaks larger than numbers. And so this revolutionary class, as Marx understands it, will inevitably overthrow the ruling class, the bourgeois class, and usher in what he imagined as a final stage of history. And forgive me if this is fairly familiar. What matters for our purposes is, one, that this is a story of progress, that there's a logic of progress inherent in history. And second, that it depends on modern industry, that it is only in the context of modern industrialized Western states that the working class will grow large enough and working shoulder to shoulder become aware of its shared condition and become conscious enough to overthrow and seize the means of production. Now, Marx is dazzled by modern industry. This, for the first time in history, as he understands it, well, objectively, is a productive force that can provide for everybody's basic needs, food, shelter, and material well-being. And only in a modern industrial economy is the socialist utopia ultimately possible. Because only in that modern economy can people be liberated enough, work as they need to, but liberated to pursue their passions, their art, whatever it might be. This happens, as I said, when the working class becomes sufficiently conscious of its shared historical condition, takes over the economy, redistributes the bounty to itself. And finally, this is meant to happen in the world's most advanced industrial economies. Marx certainly, for instance, when the Communist Manifesto was initially translated into something like 8 European languages, but Russian was not one of them, because he's writing for an English and French and a Dutch audience where industry has already become so advanced. And then from the more advanced economies, the communist revolution was meant to spread to others. But it happens first in the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire at the time is almost entirely rural. The working class is minuscule. It's something like 2% of the population that you can really call a proletariat. But this is a really shocking and unforeseen historical twist. And it lends Bolshevism its particular flavor. So to Marxism-Leninism, well here, maybe a nicer image to rest on, a peasant village, typical of Orthodox peasantry at the turn of the century. This is not Marx's vision of the modern world. So Marxism-Leninism is an innovation in ideology. We can just call it Bolshevism. Bolshevism is an attempt to take this enormous and diverse and economically backward Russian Empire and find within it forces of revolution. And the solution that Lenin settles on, here I'll, baby Lenin, famous picture in the Soviet world at least. The force that Lenin, the mechanism Lenin settles on is what's called the Vanguard Party. Not something that Marx imagines at all, but the Vanguard Party is essentially going to be a core of professional, full-time, theoretically informed revolutionaries. And in a sort of metaphysical way, this Vanguard Party, tiny core of revolutionaries, will share the aims and the desires of the working class and represent that working class in ushering in the revolution, in accelerating this process that for Marx was more of something of a natural law and a slow historical process. So the Vanguard Party, what will become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, spends its time reading and debating Marxist theory until the moment comes that it can lead a revolution, and that's precisely what happens in 1917. This tiny group of revolutionaries seizes power over the whole empire. Ultimately, their mode of organization is extremely effective. All communist movements of the 20th century will follow exactly this model of organization, and many will succeed in gaining power because the vanguard idea is a really effective and really inspiring idea for a lot of people. But the success in gaining power is entirely separate from the success in building communism. And ultimately, peculiarities of Soviet communism come from the confrontation of this vanguard idea with an empire that is very, very removed from the Marxist model. We'll return to that. And I'll skip my little picture here. You get the idea. But before we get to the revolution, some background of Ukraine as in the period before 1917. This is not Ukraine, and I'm mostly going to look at Ukraine in the 19th century and beyond, but to go deeper into its history, the Russians and Ukrainians trace their history both to the same origin, this medieval principality called Kievan Rus, based in centered in Kiev initially, but we're talking here, in the 10th century or before. Was this Russia? Was this Ukraine? The answer is a clear and definitive no. It is neither. The real relevant history here, although nationalists of Ukrainian or Russian will look back into the sort of mists of medieval time, the more important story here is in the 19th century. By that time, there are people who identify clearly as Russians, people who identify clearly as Ukrainians, and certainly a lot of people who are somewhere in between or identify primarily as Orthodox or by other ways. There was not, however, a country called Ukraine. There had never been a state by that name, and most Ukrainians live in the Russian Empire. Ukrainians were a people long before Ukraine was a country. They are Eastern Slavs. They are closely related historically, linguistically, culturally to Russians, but distinct. The language is separate, and importantly, from the 19th century, there is a sense of separateness from the Russians among Ukrainians, certainly educated Ukrainians. Not always antagonism, but a distinct identity. Most Ukrainians, though, live in the Russian Empire, which was immensely diverse. And so not just Ukrainians, and this is a gross simplification of the diversity of the empire. The Russian Empire has likely some 200 languages being spoken. The Caucasus Mountains alone is one of the most densely ethnically and linguistically complex regions on Earth. There are several major faiths, major Muslim populations, and in Eastern Europe, or the western stretch of the empire, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Russians, all self-consciously thinking of themselves as different peoples. And so, Russian Empire is not a Russian nation state or anything close to it. And this large and diverse and complicated empire is what the Bolsheviks inherited in 1917. So, at the revolution, when the Bolsheviks and the Vanguard Party come to power and need to apply communism to this state, one of the first questions they face is how to handle the internal diversity of the empire, how to turn all of these diverse peoples with widely varying histories in state formation and everything else into a unified socialist polity. And the answer that they settle on is a very peculiar one. And here we get the making of this Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, this picture. The Bolsheviks are anti-nationalists. Marxists are anti-nationalists. Marx presumes nationalism to be what they call a false consciousness, that the working class in Germany and in England and in Russia have far more in common with each other than they do with their bosses. And that nationalism is an effective tool to divide the working class. This is the Marxist position that Lenin and the Bolsheviks adopt. And in particular, Lenin and the Bolsheviks don't want to be a Russian country dominating other nationalities. Lenin is very critical of what he called Russian chauvinism, and part of the task for the Bolshevik Party is to demonstrate we are not just a different form of Russian oppressor. And in the early Bolshevik period in the 1920s, the state really makes an extraordinary effort to try to fix this historical problem of Russian domination over the other peoples of the empire. So what do? How do we structure this state? One idea, perhaps the more Marxist idea, would be to draw up the different subunits of the state by their economic functions. So we want a single unified planned economy. Why not have the agricultural regions in one state, the coal regions in another, whatever forestry, any resource, any economic function, be their own state, and then they, collaborate in a single economy that completely ignores nationality. That would be a reasonable Marxist solution to the problem, but it's not the one that they settle on. Instead, the Bolsheviks decide to send waves and waves of academic specialists and linguists and ethnographers to every far-flung corner of the Union. And, well, it's not the Union, of the Russian Empire, and figure out where the different peoples live and draw boundaries around them as best as they can. And by the historical evidence, this is really in large part a good faith effort. They're trying to figure out where Ukrainians live versus Belarusians versus Russians, where we can separate the Kyrgyz from the Uzbeks and all of these other peoples, and we're going to draw them into their own political units. They settle on, at that time, 12 ethnically defined republics. And so each of these republics has a titular ethnicity: the Ukrainian SSR for the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, Georgia, Armenia, and so forth. And then within those, if there's a minority group that's particularly concentrated, they will get their own autonomous SSR within the SSR. It's this amazing patchwork, entirely on the ethnic principle. So why? Why would the Bolsheviks, who are anti-nationalists, who are trying to eliminate these national differences, design the state around the ethnic principle? Now, these aren't independent republics, I want to make clear. They are all under the direction of Moscow. The borders are largely meaningless, but they have their own local administrations. They are encouraged to speak their national languages. They're encouraged to discover, or in some cases invent from whole cloth, a national culture and a national history that they can celebrate together. The logic is that Lenin distinguishes between Russian chauvinism, a bad nationalism, and small nation or oppressed nation nationalisms. And so this is one great act of kind of charity as they're imagining it. You give the Ukrainians their own state, you let them speak their language freely, educate their children in their language, celebrate their national traditions, and once they are convinced that this is no longer a Russian state, that they're no longer dominated by Moscow, but in some kind of harmonious whole, then the underlying need for nationalism will dissolve. In the socialist state, the sort of divisive function of nationalism is not necessary, and once peoples are shown this sort of respect, then they will ultimately recognize their shared class interest. And this is the USSR. That is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At its heart is this ethnic organization. Really, really peculiar outcome, completely divorced from anything in Marx per se, and in fact anything in Lenin, that they are putting this together in the 1920s kind of on the fly. But it ends up being a really consequential decision. Not least because these states don't, and no states, divide evenly along ethnic and linguistic and cultural lines. There are always going to be people caught between. There's going to be people mixed. There will be people who don't know what identity they most identify with. And so in Ukraine in particular, now to focus on the Ukrainian SSR in 1928, you have this proto-state, quasi-state, ostensibly dedicated to Ukrainians and ostensibly valuing and allowed to lift up Ukrainian culture. But as we move further east in this state, people tend to identify more as Russians or speak more clearly, more often speak Russian, and further west, more Ukrainian. There are Tatars, there are all kinds of Poles and Catholics and mixed people in this state, as with all of the SSRs. There are economic differences. Now, the whole state, the whole republic is fertile agricultural land. This is historically the function of Ukraine within the Russian Empire. But in the eastern region, in the Donbass, the Don Basin, there are huge coal reserves, and that's likely to be an industrial center. And so the state is internally complex. The map is oversimplified, of course. But from until 1928, in theory and in some practice, as I think we saw in the previous presentation, there is space for the development of Ukrainian culture within this Soviet system. But this changes very dramatically in the Stalin period, and with collectivization in particular. Now, the next key event in the development of Soviet Ukraine is collectivization drive in the early 1930s and the catastrophic famine that results from it. And here, more than anything, is where it matters that the Bolsheviks are not new czars. Monarchies, conservative, backward-looking. Bolshevism, with its enormous concentration of power, is determined to use that power to change everything, to reshape the society, to modernize the economy, and to oversee a transition to communism. And so the purpose of the Communist Party is to employ the state towards really dramatic transformation. All Bolsheviks agree on this, so we will not easily pin this on Joseph Stalin. There is no question in the 1920s that within the party, everyone agreed they need to collectivize agriculture, they need to industrialize the country. Stalin, to some extent, ends up just as the guy on top while this is happening. But this is a Bolshevik policy. It's too neat to isolate it with Stalin. The plan was clear from the start. And the plan, essentially, or its ultimate goal, is that the Soviet Union needs to look more like Gary, Indiana, like the American, particularly the American industrial Midwest. Modern factories of extraordinary scale. This is the model. So how do we get there? Consider what happens in Western Europe generally, as Western Europe enters the industrial era. In very brief form, there are efficiencies in agriculture that accumulate over a couple centuries, a drop in grain prices, grain surpluses, which allows for migration to the cities, or often forces migration to the cities because it's more difficult to live in the countryside. The cities then have a labor pool. Industrial development thrives on this source of labor. The factories grow larger and more complex. They produce better agricultural implements. It goes back to the countryside, and so feedback sets in. And then at some point, runaway industrial progress, which happens very quickly, but after about a century of more structural and slower paced changes. That's what happens in Western Europe. The Soviet Union, Stalinist leadership, and the Bolsheviks before him say, essentially, we need to take that 100 years of European development, and we need to do it in 10 years here by the power of the state. From the top down, the state is going to force that historical process of industrialization onto the Russian Empire and turn it into a modern industrial state as quickly as possible. This is a plan of unthinkable ambition. No state has ever attempted something so dramatic in the past. And the mechanism of doing this is twofold. To collectivize agriculture, meaning to force all the peasants with their backwards methods and their customs and traditions into single, unified, modern-looking farms with modern implements and teach them how to produce more efficiently. And to use the surplus then to industrialize, to build factories, to import factory machinery, to buy patents, whatever you have to do. Take that surplus and you use it to industrialize, all by a plan of the state. This is the entire essence of the Bolshevik project. This is the idea, how you take the Marxist idea and apply it to the Russian Empire. How you can take a country that is clearly economically backward and put it in a place to then have communism. And this is where Ukraine becomes central. Ukraine is sort of the centerpiece of this plan. Ukraine is the primary agricultural region, again, of this state. And so it will be the primary target of collectivization. Ukrainian peasants, which comprise most of the population, are going to be forced from their land as well as their customs and their traditional way of life into what the party imagines as a modern agricultural system. State-run farms, essentially, or in the most naked terms, the state is nationalizing the Ukrainian peasant. The peasant will become a full-time state worker. This is also true in the Russian agricultural regions, Kazakh agricultural regions, and many peasants will immediately refer to this as a second serfdom. This peasantry is essentially being enslaved because ultimately no peasant wants to uproot their life. Peasants are extremely conservative. They are not interested in this modernization process. It is only going to happen by force, and that is precisely what happens. The end result of this process, after several violent years of trying to force peasantry into collective farms is the famine in the winter of 1932-1933. Collectivization is extremely inefficient. It is marred by violence and chaos at all stages for several years. Eventually, the peasants are forced to eat the seed grain, and the following year, a famine is usually a 2-year cycle, and this is what happens in Ukraine by 1932-1933, as well as southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and any other grain-growing region. But in the Ukrainian case, our best estimates are 3.5 to 5.5 million deaths from this famine, and it becomes immediately a central historical memory for Ukraine, and it remains so to this day. Most Ukrainians never forget this, and they blame the Russians rather than the Soviets, and that's a distinction I make intentionally. It is cast in ethnic terms. Historians debate endlessly whether there was a specific ethnic intention, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. The Ukrainian peasant suffers disproportionately under this policy. These are some images just of the famine. There are very, very few images. During this time, the cities are completely cut off from the countryside, and these were only taken surreptitiously by a photographer who was arrested, and I would be surprised if that photographer survived. So, fleeing collectivization, and train stations and the railroad lines are just clogged with peasants trying to escape the countryside at this time. But kept there in a way that cities actually are largely often unaware. The average urban dweller really has no sense of the scale of catastrophe in the countryside. This is just a graphic image of depopulation in this region, and similar depopulation in northern Kazakhstan, either by famine or by emigration to China. So, as we approach the question of socialist realism, something shocking about this period is that in a catastrophe of this scale, a catastrophe that's entirely man-made, there is no ecological, there's no drought, there's no reason for this famine but for Bolshevik policy. How does the government maintain power? When 85% of the people in the Russian Empire are under attack in some form, whole regions like Ukraine, there's actually perfect stability in the center. There's very little attempts or challenge to Soviet power. And how is that possible? And here we return to the idea of Bolshevism as modern. Modern states are incredibly powerful. They can move whole populations. They can build cities from the ground up. This is happening in the industrialization drive. Empty spots on the steppe that have a lot of iron ore by diktat of the party become huge cities. And the state can also involve itself in people's daily lives, in their psychology, and in their art. Propaganda is too simple of an explanation. I shy from that term. Because we know that the early Stalin Revolution, this same period of collectivization and industrialization, is greeted with very widespread enthusiasm by large sets of society. Certainly in the cities, among workers, even if their conditions are not good, they feel themselves a part of something heroic and a really important historical transformation. And so there's a large degree of true belief, and a lot of the people producing art and a lot of the people celebrating this are doing so sincerely, and that's important to understand. And are willing to suffer for this utopian cause. This is far more among the working class than the peasants, almost universally not the case among peasants. And in art, this takes the form of socialist realism, this sort of enthusiasm and utopian dreaming at a time of real catastrophe. Socialist realism takes form precisely in this moment. And in the consolidation of art that happens under Stalin, where artists are forced into state group unions and forced into this state group genre. Socialist realism is usually described as an intentional conflation of the world as it is and the world that it will be, that the world to come and the utopia is blurred into the experience of everyday Soviet people, and the difference downplayed and essentially made invisible. There's a phrase from Stalin that's repeated endlessly at this period. Life has become better, comrades, life has become more joyful. And the mood of state art at this time is joyous and celebratory through much of the 30s. Now to us, it can seem like the imitation of happiness, or even a kind of perverse imitation amidst catastrophe. But perhaps it actually was okay for those who were benefiting. There were certainly a set of people, especially in the cities, who are benefiting from this process. For the average urban dweller, again, this is a period of relative calm, certainly remembered that way after the war, even if it's not a period of abundance. And memoirs attest to this, people enjoying the time, this atmosphere, this calm before the storm, which makes the mass crimes even more disturbing, which makes socialist realist art even more disturbing. And when we turn to Ukraine in particular, in the socialist realist mode, this is ultimately the context for socialist realism in Ukraine. Ukraine, on the one hand, has been given its own identity, its own culture, its own cultural institutions, at least formally. But it has also been victimized by the state in ways that appear specifically targeted at Ukraine and at Ukrainians. Ukraine has, on the one hand, an official apparatus for the arts. It has an official genre. It has an extraordinary tradition of artistic production and a lot of the same personnel who were engaged in experimental art and visionary art of past generations. But within this official genre, Ukrainians have a deep and deepened nationalist current, resentment or hatred towards Moscow, and a stronger sense than ever of their own difference as a nation. And so these are the ultimate factors feeding into what becomes Ukrainian socialist realist art, and will continue to inform it as long as the genre exists. That's all. More briefly.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Are there any comments? Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Knight. You made the point about the Bolshevik embrace of nationalism, and this is something, of course, that historians have debated. And there's one way of looking at it to say that this was essentially a pragmatic move that was in the context of the struggle of the Russian Civil War and the need to bring at least neutralize the various national movements that were part of the former Russian Empire in order to allow the Bolsheviks to prevail in the Civil War and extend their power.
Yes.
So in other words, it was a strategic, pragmatic move that was not associated with a principled embrace of nationalism as such. But then there are other views as well. And so I'm curious where you would fall down on this debate. And if you do see the Bolshevik embrace of nationalism as being something that's organic in a sense and authentic, then where is this coming from? Because as you point out, it is at odds with Marxist theory.
Absolutely.
So,
Yes, a very good question. And this is really one of the central, this is a question, one of 3 or 4 that historians of the Soviet Union are constantly wrestling over, because it is, by any measure, alien to Marxism. There's certainly not a organic or natural connection between this nationalist project or nation-building project, let's call it. Again, because a lot of the peoples who are granted these states have very little or no history of national self-identification, if we're talking Central Asia in particular. And suddenly they're a nation with a flag and a culture, or sort of a national folk culture that is largely invented. And so there is no question it is pragmatic. The Civil War is an important context. The Civil War, there are many peoples who have been under the thumb of the Russian Empire and would seize on the Civil War to find their independence. And the Bolsheviks are by and large not willing to let that happen. Finland is allowed to have its independence, with some other small exceptions, but they do not want the dissolution of the empire into a bunch of national fragments. They also are, in the longer term, looking through the 1920s, they're definitely committed to this nationalist project as a temporary measure. It is understood to be a stepping stone on the way to these distinctions dissolving entirely. And not in a way that they're all gonna end up speaking Russian or being part of a Russian center. Ultimately, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the old Bolsheviks, say Marxism is the same in any language. There's really, ultimately, these are superficial, they're emotionally important to people, they understand that, but they will lose their political character over time as the Soviet Union consolidates. Now, a lot of the debate among historians is whether this is kind of a imposition or whether there's kind of a manipulative quality in this. And I won't say a consensus, but the literature, I think, convincingly points in the other direction, that the people actually engaged in doing this mapping and in drawing the boundaries make an extraordinary good faith effort to do it right. If it can be done right. I think the ultimate answer is it can't, that it's the whole idea of separating people so neatly is folly. But there are regions in Central Asia, for instance, where you are drawing very small and complex boundaries around a people or a language group of 5,000 individuals. In the Caucasus, certainly, autonomous regions that are so minuscule and recognize some natural boundaries, and the work it's an academic project ultimately, and done very seriously. And so they, like almost everything that the Bolsheviks do through the Stalin period, they're true believers, and they believe in what they're doing to be for the best. I think I think it would be hard to call it cynical, even if it is just pragmatic. That's my impression. Thank you for the question. Please.
So regarding the famine, if I understood you correctly, it sounded like the Ukrainians historically blamed the ethnic Russians over the government socialists or communists for this. Has there been any attempt for the Russians since then to sort of distance themselves or show remorse for that, or to dispel the idea that it was an ethnic conflict?
Well, so the first point, I think that ultimately a lot of Ukrainians, and certainly who were inclined towards the nationalist position, would not distinguish between the Soviet government and the Russians from the beginning. And so the Soviet government probably is overstating or overestimating its ability to separate itself neatly from Russians as an ethnic group, for fairly understandable reasons. And so the Soviet government is certainly the object of their hatred. But from historical experience, I think from the start there's a sense that that is ultimately a foreign Russian government. Whether the Russians have made an attempt at amends at any point, briefly. So there's never a reckoning with collectivization in the Soviet period. There's a reckoning with Stalinism, but it's quite incomplete. It tends to draw too neat of a line between Lenin and Stalin, and to say, ultimately, Stalin's excesses were wrong, but the collectivization drive was right, and it was proven right by the victory in the war. And then it becomes a very complicated question, because industrialization was essential to the victory in the war. The only time that Russia as a state, or Russians as a people, try to rectify this, I think, is right at the moment of the collapse. Because when the Soviet Union collapses, the Russian public is a large part of that. They also are rebelling against the Soviet Union, against Soviet rule, against Bolshevism. They are rejecting communism as an ideology, and so it becomes in that moment very easy. In fact, when the Union is dissolved, it is an agreement between leaderships in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, primarily. It's Yeltsin. And they meet in the woods and basically, without any input, sign the dissolution of the Union. And so in that brief moment, they're able to say, we Russians and you Ukrainians rejected in equal measure the Soviet order. I don't know that there's I'm not aware of any sort of formal, I think that the Russian Federation was